All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 23, Section 4, From War to Peace. So in terms of the way that World War I was fought, recall that it was fought as trench warfare. A trench is essentially a hole in the ground. A lot of the new technology of the war, like machine guns, barbed wire, artillery, more or less made it impossible for any side to win by attacking the other. And that instead we call this war a war of attrition. And that even though it started in 1914, the U.S. didn't become involved until 1917. And really it wasn't until 1918 that some of the first U.S. troops began arriving in Europe, because it took that long to mobilize. Now, around the same time that the United States entered into the war, there was a pretty important development, and that was the situation in Russia. Now, Russia had initially been part of, what we're just going to call it the Allies, because this is the side that the United States eventually joined on. But this consisted of France, Great Britain, Russia, and then the U.S. And of course, who they were fighting against, we call them the Central Powers. This is Germany. We'll just call them Austria for short, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. In 1917, Russia bows out of the war. So this is obviously bad news for the United States. And the reason is because the Russian Revolution takes place. The Russian Revolution is the process by which Russia becomes the Soviet Union. So Tsar Nicholas II, who was the leader of Russia, Tsar, is the same thing as emperor. The war was going so poorly for Russia, they were getting beat by the Germans pretty badly, that he abdicated his throne. Abdicate is to pretty much give up. So he ran away, leaving more or less anyone to take control of Russia if they desired it. And Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized power. Lenin was, of course, the leader of the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks were communist revolutionaries. And one of the things that they did immediately upon seizing power was to end the war, right? So Russia bowed out of the conflict. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks defeated all of their other rivals in the Russian Civil War and secured that nation as the Soviet Union around the early 1920s, which made it the first communist nation in the world. And this was very alarming for the United States, not just because the Russians had bowed out, but the fact that this was a communist state, which was something the United States certainly opposed at this time, and especially later on. However, on the Western Front, which was the battle lines between France and Germany, which you see pictured right here. Not a very clear picture, but this is the Western Front. American forces arrived in 1918. General John Pershing, he led American forces in a number of battles. And it became clear by 1918 that Germany was really in no position to win, especially once American troops began arriving onto the shores of the Western Front and began pushing the Germans back. The Germans, more importantly, like I mentioned before, were losing this war of attrition. They had simply been starved out essentially for the past 4 years of the war. And knowing that, there's a new threat in the East with the Russian Revolution, it was time for the Germans to sue for peace. Similarly, Kaiser Wilhelm, Kaiser also means emperor. Kaiser Wilhelm also abdicated. And on 11/11/18, it said the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice. Actually, I'm not sure if that's spelled correctly. An armistice was signed, and an armistice is a ceasefire. Right, a ceasefire. So that's when the fighting came to an end, right, in 1918 on November 11th. Afterwards, when Germany surrendered, it then became a battle for the peace. That is what's going to happen in the post-World War I era. We have to recall that the cost of war was enormous. 10 million soldiers died. 6 million civilians died. There had really never been a conflict ever quite this large that affected so many parts of the world. And so a lot of different countries came to expect different things to happen after the war was over. It was clear that Germany lost the war, but how would that loss be handled by the victor powers? What Wilson hoped for was to create a new world order. Remember, the American delegate is Woodrow Wilson. And we talked about Wilson's foreign policy in a previous chapter. He was very idealistic. He had very lofty goals. And by this new world order, essentially what Wilson wanted, and he mentioned this a number of times, was to make the world safe for democracy. All right, so what does America want after World War I is over? Well, it wants to make the world safe for democracy, for democracies to thrive. Wilson goes to the Paris Peace Conference, which is where the victor nations will hash out what will happen after the war. And he brings his 14 points, which is 14 things, right, Wilson wants. Among them are things like, free trade, which would benefit the Americans, no alliances. He wants something called national self-determination, which means that he wants all nations essentially to rule themselves. So a lot of the things that caused the war, right, Wilson wants to make sure that it never happens again. This war was also called the war to end all wars. So to create a peaceful, global, democratic world in which everybody can trade freely with one another rather than creating sort of these alliances and ruling over people, et cetera, et cetera. One of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was a League of Nations, which was the idea for an international peacekeeping organization. So the idea to prevent war from ever happening again, well, let's just create an international peacekeeping organization. That way, if two nations have a problem with one another, they could hash it out there. However, though, he was also competing with the British there and the French there, and they didn't always want the same thing. What came out of the Paris Peace Conference was the Treaty of Versailles, which of course dealt with what should happen with Germany. And in fact, very little of it actually resembled what the United States wanted. So for example, this idea of national self-determination, well, for Great Britain and France, they really just wanted to acquire more territory. So both the German colonies, which again had belonged to Germany, were taken by France and Great Britain. And a mandate system was created in the Middle East out of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was a ally of Germany. So both the Ottoman Empire and Germany lost, and both of that land ended up in the hands of Great Britain and France. So they got, the British and the French got more land out of this than really the United States, I think, would like to have seen. You also had part of the Treaty of Versailles as the war guilt clause. This blamed Germany for the war. Now, having talked about this earlier, we know that Germany likely isn't 100% to blame for the conflict, but at the Treaty of Versailles, they made sure to make sure that Germany was responsible. And probably more so than anything else, what Great Britain and France wanted was reparation payments. They wanted Germany to pay for the war. And so that was part of the Treaty of Versailles as well. So a lot of historians have looked back at the Treaty of Versailles in hindsight, given that we know what happens afterwards, and I said, maybe this was too harsh. And, if you were to blame the Versailles Treaty for being too harsh, you could probably point to these two countries involved that more so than the United States, really kind of wanted revenge out of this war, whereas Wilson, again, wanted more of an idealistic world to be created in the aftermath. However, one thing that Wilson did get was the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created as an international body to create peace. However, a controversial article or controversial part of it was Article 10, which more or less stated that all members are equal. All right, so the idea is that League of Nations invites other countries all join together to be part of this international government. Article 10 says, well, all those member nations are essentially legal, are equal to one another. Now, Wilson and the U.S. president doesn't have the power to commit the United States to, a treaty unilaterally that's actually approved of by the Congress. And so Wilson comes back home and he needs to get the treaty ratified by Congress. And this sparks a huge debate, especially between the Senate and Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a senator. And both the Senate and Lodge really lead a resistance against U.S. participation in the League of Nations, right? Henry Cabot Lodge is like the most ardent opponent of the League of Nations. It came down to Article 10, and that's to say that really the United States did not want to consider themselves on equal footing as these other less powerful nations. The United States comes out of World War I, arguably the most powerful nation in the entire world. Their rivals, Great Britain and Germany, are greatly damaged by the war, where the U.S. really avoided much of the conflict, made a lot of money off the war, and then jumped in on the winning side. So the U.S. comes out of World War I in a really good position internationally. And this idea of all the nations being equal really didn't bode well for many Americans. The irreconcilables, they reject the League of Nations no matter what. So they says, no matter what you say, I don't want the U.S. to be part of this international government. We have to look over, we in the United States should look after our own affairs. The reservationists, they might, with some changes, right? They say, okay, maybe you change Article 10 and perhaps, we, the senators that consider ourselves reservationists, perhaps we will vote yes. The bottom line was that the vote to join the League of Nations went to the Senate twice. It was rejected by the Senate twice. And so the League of Nations was created as Woodrow Wilson's idea, but the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. In fact, Wilson went on a tour of the country trying to promote and encourage the United States to join the League. He ultimately fell ill, suffered a stroke, and passed away not very long after his presidency was over. But the United States officially never became part of this international effort to try to keep the peace.